You are listening to the Casting Shadows podcast, a podcast where we have action, reaction, and interaction about role-playing games. A place where, regardless of whether you're into role-playing games for the story as a product of play or the story as a byproduct of play, regardless of intention, we look at techniques and perspectives that help you get more from what you do around the table with your friends. Because we believe that role-playing games are played by friends with friends. This episode, which could conceivably be a brief episode, all past evidence to the contrary, builds from listener calls to drill in on 2 points in the recent Call of Cthulhu episode. The 2 points are related to skills. 1, what happens after you use them? How is improvement done in basic role-playing? This is really quite interesting. And the other side of it is, well, if we are thinking about rolling skills versus not rolling skills, how is that decided? How do we know when it's the right time not to roll in from a mechanical point of view? So we're going to hear calls from Menion, also known as Rob, and we're going to hear calls from Jason Connerly. And in the background, there may or may not be commentary from 1d6 dogs, which are scattered around me as I record. Our first caller comes to us from the podcast Confessions of a Wee Tim'rous Bushi. And, well, it's someone that we all know, I think, if you're listening in the Anchor RPG community. This is Rob, also known as Menion, or Menion, also known as Rob.
Hello Anthony, this is Robert, also known as Menion, just calling in to say hello and thank you for the latest episode in which you discussed why Call of Cthulhu was the game for you and what it had taught you about games. As you know, I'm currently playing and running Runequest Glorantha, so your take on some of the more gnarly areas, the skills and how to decide when to make a roll, is something that's quite pertinent to my game at the moment. We did actually run some Call of Cthulhu previously, but only a few sessions. That's beside the point though. One thing I did want to ask you, and I'm not sure if I've got time in this first call, is what happens when you decide that a skill check is not called for, but the players miss out on the opportunity to get an experience check? So I'll just repeat that. In the case where somebody, say, is of great experience and that a role really wouldn't be necessary or appropriate for that character because of their level of experience, is it necessary to roll? And if you don't roll, are you depriving that player of the chance for gaining further experience in that check? Now, in that skill. Now, I'm not sure if it's really important, and I'm not sure if you were saying that previously. Obviously, we don't roll where it's not necessary to roll. But that point, whether it's because of the character's level of skill, or whether it's because, it's such an everyday thing, or it's really not in such a risky situation that, yes, you can do it. By saying that, it seems to me that, yeah, we are depriving players of making a decision about when players can make a change. And that has come up recently in our 5th session of RuneQuest. Players wanted to interact and do things like dancing and singing during a festival. And to me, it was kind of beside the point. It wasn't part of the story as such. I mean, it was something I would say, yeah, sure, you dance and have a good time. But the success or failure of that dance would in no way change the the adventure, the story, the drama that was to unfold. So in that case, I said the check, you don't need to make a skill roll, therefore they cannot get a skill check. What do you think about that? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Hopefully that's clear enough. Anyway, cheers. Bye-bye.
Okay, before we get to my original answer, I'm going to make this editorial insertion. Why? Because my answer wound up being something like 18 minutes long, and I don't think that's fair for someone to have to listen to an almost podcast length response to get an answer. So, what did I end up actually saying? What do I think about a game master saying, there's no role for this, and therefore deny them right out of the gate the opportunity for an experience check? Do I agree with it? Yes, actually. There are rationales for this in various versions of BRP. You'll hear me talk about that if you can stomach the idea of going through an 18-minute answer that follows. But the idea is the games master is the ultimate arbiter of what does and doesn't count as worthy of an experience check. And the key point is that some life-altering experience happened, whether that's a long period of time practicing the skill under normal conditions where a variety of things can happen that aren't life-threatening but do offer learning experiences, or moments of nail-biting terror or life-and-death situations and struggles like that, or struggles against a superior opponent or challenges that have never been seen before, and you have to figure out how to apply your experience to it to maybe eke out a success, that kind of thing. Simply dancing at a festival is not, and really never will be, check-worthy unless something else is going on. Like they need to perform in front of someone important, or they've developed some new dance, or written new music, or some other way that may or may not meet local societal norms, or that may in some way enhance or go against local tradition. So in other words, they're being tested, and in that case, they would need to roll. So in Runequest Glorantha, an element that is true about other versions of BRP has been removed. That being, experience checks can be assigned in other versions of BRP without a roll. But in Runequest Glorantha, a roll is necessary. And why do we roll? Because it's not a normal situation. So if you are saying, according to the rules of Runequest Glorantha, that no, you can just do this, there's no roll, you're giving a clear signal that there's nothing in this that offered the characters an opportunity to develop that skill. And that's totally fair. There's nothing wrong with it. Now, if you want to know more, stick around. Otherwise, jump ahead about 18 minutes. This is editorial insertion number 2, and it's coming from the future, from the perspective of when this was recorded. Thanks to a timely call from Jason, it has been pointed out that I have misspoken, basically because it's an extemporaneous podcast, and I wound up repeating a phrase over and over again. So, when we start talking about skill improvement and your chances for skill improvement, and I start talking about using skills with or without a check, or with or without a roll, you're going to hear me say over and over again, successful use. Now, in some versions of the system, it is a successful use that is required, and on a failure, you would consider going for training. But that's in the systems where there are rules for training. In others, it's simply the use. So when you hear me say successful use, please substitute use. Okay. Most of the time, that should get us through. And I'll do an update about this in a subsequent episode. But for now, let's get back into what I originally said. Thanks very much for the call. It's totally clear, and it's a really important one when people are first getting into, or getting into again, returning to some version of basic role playing. And over the years, there hasn't been a lot of change, but there's always been a certain, not really ambiguity, but that thing that quality that I was talking about in the original episode about leaning toward rulings over or in the absence of rules, to take things on a case-by-case basis and determine how to apply the rule rather than looking for each case in the rules to get a definitive answer, which is different from looking at a rule and saying, I'm changing it because of my feeling, right? Which I think we hear conflated with the idea of rulings over rules fairly often out there on the internet. So I don't like this rule, so I'm going to house rule it because to make the game my own. This is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that there's a certain way of talking about the information or the situation in original BRP, which during its evolution has changed, as it goes off and becomes Runequest 6 and then Mithras, as it then later appears in Runequest Glorantha. We can see two distinct styles or approaches revolving around whether or not this philosophy of roar will be followed. So in the specific case of experience, BRP, and one of the things that I loved first about it, has a stochastic experience system. It has an unknowable experience system, unlike pretty much most other games where you fulfill some sort of action in-game and you'll receive a set number of experience points for that action, and then later on be able to use those experience points to improve the character. This is not really how BRP, in all of its various forms, works. Instead, we get the experience roll, and in some versions of BRP, we also get training. So as you mentioned in your call, in play, certain things will happen. Certain skills will be relevant, and a successful experience or an appropriate experience with that skill may enable the player to make an experience roll for their character. Common complaints from detractors against BRP have been that players would then try to bring skills into the game that are not relevant, and they would keep hounding the game master for an opportunity to use this skill or that skill to make a roll for this or a roll for that in order to gain that check so they have a potential to improve their character. There's lots of reasons for this. Either they simply want the character to improve just generally, or they're on the track of membership in some organization or cult or brotherhood or sisterhood or whatever, and they require a broad number of skills to be at a requisite level in order to qualify for whatever level they want to be in for that organization. And this can be frustrating. This can feel like the clearly outlined situation, as you were talking about, the point of, let's just use the word adventure for brevity. Brevity, I wish. Whatever the reason that we're playing tonight, the player drive to simply gain a check in a skill can make it possible to lose the coherence or make it possible to follow any kind of flow from one situation to the next. So, game masters would decide to give or not give checks, and it can be a point of contention, hence your question. What I find particularly interesting about this question is that in the earliest forms of BRP, the reason a check was granted was successful use of the skill. Now, in early Runequest, there's not a lot of focus on skills. Skills exist, but what would later become a key and central point of basic role-playing, this development system, hadn't yet developed. There were the core abilities of the character, and then there were combat skills, and then there were other skills. And training existed as a concept, but it was definitely focused on the martial skills of the character. And learning from experience was definitely there, but it too was focused on the martial skills of the character. And there it said, if at some point during the adventure you successfully hit somebody, and just actually hit, it didn't matter if actual damage was done to armor or to the flesh beneath the armor, but if you just successfully landed a blow, then you could qualify for an experience check. And so, in the way that game is written, that means a roll is required. You rolled the dice, you successfully hit. Regardless of what happened after that, probably you're going to be given an experience check. Because the number of times that happened is not relevant to whether or not a skill check has been earned. Right? So this is just basic stuff for listeners who are not as conversant with BRP as you currently are running Runequest Glorantha. Once BRP goes out on its own, however, and becomes later versions of Runequest, not Runequest 1 and 2, but Stormbringer and Call of Cthulhu and the other games I was mentioning, once it gets out there and the other skills become more of a focal point than they were in Runequest 1 and 2, once that happens, the game actually stops talking about requiring a successful roll. It starts saying, on a successful use of the skill. And this can be whether it was rolled or unrolled. But of course, I think we tend to logically associate use as a rolled situation. So if we follow through the lineage of the games and we go all the way through down to Mithras, then what we see is that all of this has disappeared, and instead, it says at the end of a session, or the end of an adventure, the end of an appropriate period of time according to the game master, who is always the final arbiter in these cases, the game master will give a number of experience rolls. They're actually giving out rolls, like 1 to 4 rolls. No checks. No checks required. And it still works the same way as it always did. The higher your current skill is, the harder it's going to be for you actually to earn some experience points. And Mithras, of course, in RuneQuest 6 before it gave specific guidance on what would be an appropriate number, random number of experience points to generate on a successful experience roll, like 1 to 4, or if you're playing on an accelerated timeline, 1d6. So following that branch of the system, we go from a focus totally on the combat skills, really, and that a successful roll is necessary, which very soon becomes successful use of a skill can be, at the game master's discretion, awarded a check. And then ends up being a certain number of experience rolls are going to be given out at the end of the right amount of time. If we follow the other lineage through, we wind up with Runequest Glorantha. And here we move away from the sort of interpret based on our understanding of how the world works to instead a more rules-based structure. The game is actually pretty clear on how experience checks are determined and all the stuff that goes along with it. So it's once again back to requiring an actual roll. And this is what gives your question so much bite. And see, I followed through the other lineage. So for me, I don't associate the experience check with rolls. I associate it with successful use of a skill. whether it was rolled or whether it was allowed to be unrolled as unnecessary. And one of the things that would inform whether or not an experience check was granted was how mundane that situation was and how little risk or stress or pressure there was. If it was simply the standard performance of the skill, then there's really nothing there to learn. But if there was some aspect, some hint that could work to further the character's knowledge, or if they had to do a tremendous amount of work and we were compressing a large amount of time, then again, it would make sense to award an experience check for that vast compression of time, because who knows what could have come up during that if we were playing. But a successful use when there was a roll and it's relevant to what's actually going on in the character's life, well, it's pretty hard to turn that down as well. So this is kind of my opinion. This is my reaction. This is my normal in association with these rules. So you ask me, what do I feel about it? Well, I feel that it doesn't matter if they roll or not. It matters if it's successful and relevant to the ongoing development of the character. Then it would matter. So simply dancing at a festival, as you described, is simply going to be dancing at the festival as described. And if they're trying to do something different at that festival, change a tradition, or exhort a deity, or do something beyond just dancing, well, then maybe the idea of a check is on the table. As we said a few minutes ago, despite any effort to try and be brief, the rules in Runequest Glorantha are very specific that it's tied to a roll. And it's still the game master's determination of whether or not it will be worthy of a check. It's a little silent on how the game master is going to make those decisions, but still the idea of this developmental system is that the character is able to successfully use the skill while under tremendous pressure, or the character is able to successfully apply the skill to a situation that is outside the norm. They have an opportunity to learn something. They have an opportunity to realize what they didn't know and reflect on that to develop, or they have an opportunity to recognize that they haven't been practicing enough, or something along those lines. They, like any kind of skill that we practice, there are moments where something that we think we know how to do, we discover that we can't. And in the moment, we pull something from deep inside ourselves and are successful. And we think, woof, I've learned something from this experience. There are, other ways to think about it. Well, maybe we should focus on failure also being important, but that takes us more in the area of training, which is not really in the area of your question, but the idea being, because you failed, because your skill wasn't good enough, because you couldn't find the answer, in an unpracticed raw form inside you, after it's over, after you reflect on that failure, you would go and seek out training so that that didn't happen again, is kind of the idea. So, to summarize this too long answer to your very important question, the Game Master is the ultimate arbiter according to the rules, but there's no reason why this couldn't be thrown out to the table to discuss. The situation and the situation's effect on the character in terms of developing as a user of that skill. One of the things to keep in mind is the relative importance to the character in the moment, the relative difficulty of using the skill in the moment, and its likelihood of causing some sort of lasting effect on the character. The skill system isn't there to generate skill checks for experience rolls later for every use of the skill. It simply isn't. It's there for relevant, important, and ultimately life-changing uses of the skill as determined by an impartial arbiter, the games master, most often. And one last detail, kind of an important one that I think gets overlooked, is the relative level of competence of the characters. And depending on the game you're playing, that level of competence changes. You know, when we think about Runequest, we generally think about younger characters who are, you know, beginning their life and beginning their career. They are adults in their communities. They are trained. They are expected to be able to do things. They have professions. They have memberships in, you know, in game terminology, they have memberships in cults, and they're expected to be cultivated by the community, and they're expected to cultivate their own skills themselves. There's these expectations. But in other expressions of BRP, these characters are even more competent or even more capable. And of course, there's always the aging aspect. You can play an older character and start out, you know, farther along the road of development. What I'm saying is that these characters are going to progress through play, but they're going to progress quite slowly. They're not going to go up in level rapidly like we're used to in some games, so they're not going to get a major allotment of experience points to you know, save up and compile in order to make major changes to the character after the end of certain adventures. The experience system does a very good job of providing an experience of development over time. Characters will need to focus on getting specifically trained if they really want to improve in specific skills. And they're going to see that over time, their core competencies rise up to a certain plateau and then, you know, rarely, if ever, improve after that. But some of the things that they use infrequently might at times benefit from some, you know, shocking and jarring and life-changing experiences. But unlike zero to hero play, we shouldn't expect these characters to change much. So if we go into play considering that the characters are good, they are competent, and only major experiences, major events in their lives are going to cause some of these skills to change, then it's a lot easier to feel good about the changes that do come. And I think it's a lot easier as the games master to say, no, in this case, regardless of whether it was rolled or unrolled, no, in this case, this is not worth an experience check. This is just a normal, mundane experience, no pressure, and really nothing to learn. Simply, it's an opportunity to demonstrate your ability. So I hope my lengthy explanation of my, you know, short opinion helps in some way. And if not, let me know, and I'll try to be less expansive in a later response. All right, by this point in the episode, anybody who is wondering how my idea for a 5 to 10 minute episode about Call of Cthulhu could blossom into a more than 1 hour long episode, you know, will no longer be wondering about that, because this short response to listener calls episode is already so long. But let's not be daunted by things like the length of an episode. Let's carry on. Speaking of carrying on, the next set of calls are shifting away from character improvement and all that goes into that and toward skills. And so, let's go to Jason of the Nerds RPG Variety Cast as he brings in some ideas and comments about different ways to handle skills and different ways to assess the idea of when a roll is or isn't necessary.
Hey Anthony, Jason here. Great episode on Call of Cthulhu. Really enjoyed it. I think you brought up some interesting points, and I really like the distinction between raw and roar. I, tend to describe myself kind of as a raw master or raw game master, but really I'm a roar game master because there are things that I do change if it works better. So I think that is accurate. For example, one thing I like to do is change, depending on the system, something like Marvel Superheroes or Cyberpunk 2020. I like to change where you spend your points, like your karma in Marvel Superheroes and the equivalent in Cyberpunk 2020. I like to change it where you spend it after the roll, not before the roll. The other thing I'm going to change in the future, and in fact, another game that's recently been discussed with a group I play with is we may start up a very sporadic Palladium fantasy game. And one thing I will apply to that with the skills is to use the Unknown Army system with skills. And I think the Unknown Army system is really good. It's an evolution of the BRP. You're probably familiar with Unknown Armies. I like 2nd edition Unknown Armies personally. That's my go-to edition of that game. And, well, here, why don't I just read you the rules for skills, because they're pretty short, and your listeners may not have them handy.
I'm going to briefly, truly, honestly, briefly leap in here to say Jason's about to quote to us from Unknown Army's 2nd edition, as he said he was going to. This only takes 3 or 4 minutes, and then it gets into discussion about skills. It's really worth listening to. It's kind of interesting. And if you have Unknown Army's 1st edition, it's particularly interesting to hear the changes between the 2 editions, and weirdly, what sentences and sentence fragments stayed the same.
So, the skills for Unknown Army 2nd edition. Skills are a narrow application of stats. You can be a huge, strong guy, but if you've never been in a fight or got trained to throw a punch, a lot of people can clean your clock. Skills work on a percentile basis, from 1 to 99. You roll percentile dice and compare the result to your skill. How this works depends on the situation, since you make one of 3 different kinds of skill checks. For minor skill checks, you need a 15% or higher skill rating for an automatic success. No dice needed. These are situations where you have plenty of time and no risk, like taking a photograph of your house or reading up on Greek history. Higher skill levels are important for significant skill checks. These happen when you aren't in an intense situation, such as combat, but there's still some pressure on you, or what you're doing is a high element of uncertainty. Spending a day hacking an unfamiliar operating system, keeping an eye on your husband in a big crowd, or studying for a weekly test could qualify. These tasks, you have a strong success if you roll under your skill level. If you fail the roll, you get a weak success if that roll is still under the related stat. You only fail completely if you roll above your stat. Major skill checks are the big ones, and in Occult Underground they happen all the time. All combat rolls are major checks, as are any actions you attempt under stress and risk. If it really matters, it's a major check. There's a limit to how high your starting skill ratings can be. The limit depends on what kind of campaign you're playing in. A street level maximum is 55%, global level 70, and cosmic levels 85. Those have to do with how powerful your characters are in that game. If you have a good reason for a higher starting skill than allowed, ask the GM for approval. Yada yada yada. Okay, so that's basically the way skills work in Unknown Armies. And that was reminded to me over on a podcast called The Glitter Boys, BOIS, which is a Palladium podcast I've been listening to recently. But they reminded me that's how Palladium or Unknown Armies works, because the Palladium skills are notoriously start off very low, and that's a solution that they found that worked for them. And I really like that, because that way, just like in Call of Cthulhu, if it's not important, you don't roll. But here, if you have that skill, it's at least 15%, then you're automatically going to succeed, unless, it's a complicated roll, there's a lot of pressure, you're in combat or whatever. So it's the same kind of thing. But the only thing you'd have to really modify here is you might have to do the Call of Cthulhu thing, where you take their stat and multiply it by 5 to get the number for that middle skill level, where if you roll over the skill but under the stat. Anyway, that's a skill system I really like. It's really not that different than Call of Cthulhu, so I don't know why I wasted your time reading it. No need to, I guess, play that on the air, but I did enjoy the episode, and I guess I'll talk to you soon.
There have been many times when I've wished it was possible to listen to an anchor message that you have already submitted. I don't mean preview the message before you submit it. I mean after you've sent it off to the intended target. It would be nice if you could listen to it again. I've been in Jason's situation many times where I've sent stuff off and I can't remember if I've said what I wanted to say, or I'm not sure that what I said was relevant or useful. So I want to reassure Jason that what he has said is both relevant and useful. It's really interesting to look at this because Unknown Armies is definitely drawn from the long tradition of BRP. And when you look at Unknown Armies first edition, which is the edition that I have, I don't have the second edition. When you look at it, it really feels that, much like Apocalypse World would do later, it codifies standard practice around a certain type of play and apply their own spin on the language used or the jargon chosen in order to communicate those ideas. So, when new gamers encounter these games as, among their first games, it's eye-opening and revelatory and makes a huge impact as if it's invention. And for us older gamers who come across these games, it's often just as eye-opening and just as revelatory because it's finally saying the things that we were pretty sure were meant, but not actually said in the original text, or were said so quickly, like perhaps in one sentence, that it's really easy to miss or convince yourself it may or may not be there. There's ambiguity, maybe. And so one of my long-standing struggles with BRP is exactly this. When do we roll? Which is why I spent so much time talking about it in the previous episode, right? To me, it clearly says you don't need to roll in the following situations. But so many people, as we can hear Daniel Norton of the Bandit's Keep podcast saying on Jason's recent episodes, so many people out there play differently from what is said. So many so, it makes you kind of wonder, is what I know there really there? So in this case, in Unknown Armies, it's really interesting how it's categorized about where success comes from, how do we generate a weak success, how do we actually fail, and what, according to the rules, constitutes no need to roll. It's a pretty low chance, really, when you think about it, these minor situations, which means you would tend to roll in Unknown Armies second edition. And that particular roll about automatic successes is the same in Unknown Armies first edition. It's still that 15%. But everything else Jason said about that section doesn't actually appear in first edition. It's really interesting. Between the first and the second editions, they moved away from the rulings and roar aspects of learn to interpret the rules, learn to apply the rules using these guidelines, right, in accordance with what you know of how the world works, much like I was talking to Menion earlier. They've moved away from that toward much more specificity, moving away from abstracted writing that is guidance about how to improvise in the moment, right, how to react to and deal with situations, and toward here are the rules. It's really interesting that it would happen so quickly. So, I also want to thank Jason for the reference to the Glitter Boys podcast. I haven't had a chance to listen yet, but it's always fun to hear people talking about Palladium. And Palladium, like Jason said, is notorious for very low skill chances. A friend of mine that I play with regularly recently got to try Palladium Fantasy First Edition, and was rightfully shocked at how low a lot of his skill chances were in that game. And it's kind of interesting here, too, that much like basic role-playing, which really assumed that game masters were going to be applying modifiers, both positive and negative, to rolls, but didn't give a lot of guidance in the earlier editions. There's much better guidance about that now in 7th edition, for example, and in Runequest Glorantha. But back in the day, there was maybe the curse of knowledge going on with the writers thinking that it was obvious. And you can, looking back with modern eyes on Palladium Fantasy First Edition, you can see signs all through the text that modifiers are being applied to percentage chances, to skill rolls, and to hit rolls all over the place for all sorts of reasons. But there's no section that talks about making rolls. There's no section in first edition that talks about, here's a sample modifier for this kind of situation, like trying to use a climb skill in high wind, in the rain, in the darkness. You could apply this. Now, when we get to second edition Palladium Fantasy, there is a section about modifiers, and they're pretty nasty modifiers. Plus 20, minus 40, minus 20. They're pretty nasty modifiers. But they're for, again, very specific things, such as the use of alien technology or, alien magic or, mysterious magic from some long ago culture that has no context. Very specific use of pretty heavy negative modifiers, from which we need to infer that it's okay to apply modifiers, both positive and negative, to things like skill checks when we play the game. But once again, it doesn't really come out and say that. We just have to understand it. And so a game like Unknown Armies is a fantastic piece of the hobby to have in your library to see the jump. They're clearly inspired by BRP. The way that the whole game works is clearly drawn from that original source, and the advice that's everywhere throughout the creation of the text, from the very beginning all the way through to the end. Like, the writers are talking to you, the reader, about playing the game. It's not written like a textbook at all. All the advice there is clearly based on a lot of frustration, I think, and argument and ambiguity, either perceived or real, in that rule set. So it's a very relevant set of calls. Jason, don't worry about it. Really interesting and totally adds to the conversation. Okay, well, we passed the 40-minute mark, so let's wrap this up. I think if people are interested in a survey of basic role-playing from its inception through to, the mid-2000s, then the Big Gold Book is a great place to go, because it is designed as a toolkit, much like Mithras to follow, or RuneQuest 6. It's designed as a toolkit, but it's designed as a toolkit for, to be an all-in-one resource, and it gives you an idea of different types of roles, which appeared in some BRP games and not others, different ways of doing experience and training that appeared in some but not in all games, and so on and so forth. So it really is a very helpful summary and survey of a lot of the flexibility and power and beauty of that particular system. It's a satisfying read. And when held up in comparison to whatever earlier form of BRP you might be using, it can help frame questions or answer questions or reveal underlying preferences that you might have that will guide you toward more satisfaction in play, either to playing it exactly how it's written in the original, or making some tweaks of your own, or choosing one of the options that are available in BRP, or something in between. But as a second opinion in the room, it can be pretty valuable, I think. Now, since it came out, of course, there have been a lot of other developments, moving toward Mithras in one chain, a really elegant version, maybe the best version of the D100 rules that I've ever found, or moving toward the specificity of Runequest, Glorantha. I think there's a lot of things to consider. Of course, there's other contenders out there now, things that are openly drawn from BRP or are more surreptitiously copying from it. Things like Raiders of Relia, an Edwardian Call of Cthulhu variant based openly on OpenQuest, which is a version of BRP. And then there is Zweihander. So there's a lot of stuff out there. And also in the chain of OpenQuest, we can find the Renaissance rules, which are used for a variety of things, much like you find BRP is. So each one of these has their different take on some of the specifics of play, like how combat might work at the nitty-gritty level, or how skills are applied, or what base chances are. For example, in Mithras, your base chance is going to be based on your character's attributes or characteristics, while in a lot of BRP, they are flat percentages like 5% or 0. So there's a really big range to explore, a lot of questions to ask, and your own answers to discover for satisfaction at the table with the people that you're playing with now, and the game that you're playing now. And I think that's part of the fun when getting into toolkit systems rather than smaller systems that are very lean and targeted on one specific play experience. One of the core elements to remember about Runequest and the games which followed through the BRP line is your Runequest may vary, which now for me has become your Mithras may vary, but really, honestly, your application of the rules may vary. And not only is that okay, it's expected, it's going to happen, so go with it and enjoy it. Anyway, until the next time, take care. But wait, there's more. Since Call of Cthulhu, which started this whole series of episodes, is an investigation game, let's have a Columbo moment. But there's just one more thing. If you haven't heard enough from me in this episode or through RPG A Day through the past month, there are some more opportunities to do so. I appeared this week in 2 different podcasts. One is on YouTube from a new channel called Substandard Roleplaying. And there, the hour-long interview is a survey of a lot of different subjects related to role-playing, and maybe some of the takes there will be interesting, especially if you followed a previous discussion that Jason and a few of others of us had about it depends. The second one is the episode where I appear as a guest panelist in the Brain Trust on GM Mastermind, which is hosted by Sean Kelly, formerly of Gaming and BS, and my fellow panelist for that is Brett, formerly of Gaming and BS. That one is talking about story and how it, as a concept, as an intention for play, and as something that just takes care of itself, can be relevant to your preparation, to your session 0, to checking in with your players later, to figuring out what's going right with your game, to figuring out what's going wrong with your game, and what techniques to apply and when to apply them. It's the foundation of further discussion. So that episode is called Story, 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 and you can find it at the GM Mastermind podcast, which is available where all fine podcasts are sold. Anyway, for real now. Take care. You've been listening to an episode of the Casting Shadows podcast. an extension of the Casting Shadows blog, found at castingshadowsblog.com. By, well, me, and I guess I'm better known as Runeslinger. You can find me on YouTube more often than not at youtube.com/Runeslinger. Why would you want to do these investigations? Well, pretty much the only thing I talk about there is role-playing games and how to better learn them, how to kind of squeeze out more enjoyment from them, and, of course, from time to time, different games to try and what they do well. So if any of that sounds interesting, please check them out. And if what I have to say connects with you in some way, well, then contact me here or in the other ways provided to do so.